like to introduce Dr. Timothy Bartik. Dr. Bartik is going to be our provocateur today. He's going to present us with some of the work that he's done on policies to improve place-based policy for distressed places. Many of you will know Dr. Bartik. His research focuses on how broad-based prosperity can be advanced through better local labor market policies. This includes both policies affecting labor demand, such as state and local economic development policies, and policies affecting labor supply, such as place-based scholarships. Many of us have used his work in our research and teaching. His book, Who Benefits from State Local Economic Development Policies, is widely cited, and it's been a very influential review of evidence on how local policies affect economic development. He's the co-editor of Economic Development Quarterly, the only journal focused on local economic development in the United States. Dr. Bartik's done quite a bit of work on local labor markets, and I will put his complete bio up on Member 365 following the program today. But with no further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Bartik.
Well, thank you. And let me first of all get my slides up here. And let's see here. Okay, is that working properly? I assume
yes,
so.
Your camera's off.
I don't know why that went off, but you can see my screen though?
Yes.
I have no idea why my camera went off, and I can't change it right now without, do you want to see me? I can change this. Let's see here. I can stop that, and let's see, start video. Okay, I'll share screen again. Here we go. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I'll talk for about 15 minutes, and then we can have questions and discussion. And I'm honored to be here today because I think that the work that you folks are engaged in, I've argued in the past, is some of the most cost-effective ways of promoting local economic development. So what I hope to do today in my 15 minutes is provide some research evidence that either might provide arguments for expanding what you do, increasing its scale, or perhaps one or two useful ideas for improving your work. And I have, let's see here. Now there we go. 3 main points. First of all, the nature of the problem. When we talk about the problems of distressed places, there are 2 very different types of distressed places that require very different solutions. Distressed local labor markets, distressed neighborhoods. One size does not fit all. You need to use different solutions. Second point, when you try to solve these problems, although tax incentives can work, there are more cost-effective solutions, which are typically different types of services, either services to business to create jobs in local labor markets, or services to residents of distressed neighborhoods to increase their access to jobs. And the final comment is, even if you use the most cost-effective ways to increase job opportunities for people, if we really want to address the problems of distressed places in the US, we're going to need to significantly expand what we do. And I have some dollar figures on what that would cost. It is affordable, but it's not cheap. It would amount to less than 1% of federal tax revenue or less than 3% of state tax revenue. So at the federal or state level, this could be addressed, but it's not a trivial matter. Okay, so first of all, as I said, there are 2 problems. One is the distressed local labor market problem, and let's describe the size of that. So by a local labor market, I simply mean some multi-county area that includes most commuting flows. I mean things like metro areas, micropolitan areas, or in rural areas, commuting zones. And when you look at economic distress, and if you define that by the prime age employment rate, the employment to population ratio for persons aged 25 to 54, about 10% of the US population lives in severely distressed local labor markets where the prime age employment rate is more than 10 percentage points below what could be considered full employment. And there's another 30% that live in local labor markets that are above, that are not quite that badly off, but are at least 5 percentage points in below full employment as measured by the prime age employment rate. And if you look at what areas this includes, it includes a huge geographic portion of the US, includes a lot of rural areas, particularly in the South, particularly in Appalachia, but it also includes upstate New York. It includes places like Flint, Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, and my home state of Michigan. And it also includes a lot of the West Coast outside of the booming coastal cities. So it's a huge problem in the US. How about distressed neighborhoods? Neighborhoods, I'm going to proxy for neighborhoods using census tracts. Census tracts have an average size of about 4,000 people. Sometimes that might be a little smaller than what people consider to be a neighborhood, but you can combine several census tracts to make up the neighborhood. And about 10% of the US population lives in census tracts that are severely relatively distressed compared to the local labor market. That is, their prime age employment rate is more than 10 percentage points below the local labor market. And in some cities, this is much higher. That, for example, the city of Detroit, 49% of the population are in census tracts that are more than 10 percentage points below the overall metro area labor market prime age employment rate. Okay. So why are these problems very separate? Well, they're very separate problems because in the case of distressed labor markets, you can revitalize a distressed local labor market by creating jobs there. And in fact, that's more efficient than putting jobs in booming areas. So, if you put jobs in booming areas, it mostly just leads to in-migration because there are no non-employed workers to hire. So as you create jobs, all you do is induce in-migration, which might have some benefits as well as some costs, but does not boost the standard of living of the original local residents. And you might get in a booming area, 16% of the new jobs might go to increase the employment rate. And in a distressed area, over half, 54.5% of the jobs go to increasing the employment rate. Why? Because there are more non-employed workers available. And now you might say, why is 54% so low? And the reason is, even if ultimately, new jobs either increase the employment rate or increase in-migration. If a firm, for example, newly created jobs, there are 100 jobs created in an area, and all the jobs are filled by local residents who already are employed, that creates job vacancies. And there's this job vacancy chain. And if you follow the logic of it, ultimately a new job has to either result in an increase in the original resident's employment rate or an increase in in-migration. There's no other alternative. Now, if you look at distressed neighborhoods, creating a job in a distressed neighborhood doesn't really do that much necessarily to help people in that neighborhood. And the reason is pretty straightforward. Most people in the US don't work in the neighborhood they live in. That includes distressed neighborhoods. And most jobs in any neighborhood, including distressed neighborhoods, are not held by residents of that neighborhood, very small percentage. So, I estimate that in a small distressed neighborhood, that's 5% of the local labor market. If you create a job there, only 4% of the jobs you create there will go to residents of that neighborhood. So it simply is not a very effective way of helping residents in that neighborhood. It is for local labor markets. It's not for neighborhoods. They need totally different solutions to their problems. A solution for local labor markets is creating jobs. What are the most effective way of creating jobs? Well, you can use business tax incentives. The estimates are that's relatively costly because a lot of them do not actually tip location decisions. And the cost per job created from various research studies ends up being about a little less than $300,000 per job created. On the other hand, there's pretty good research on infrastructure, customized job training, manufacturing extension services, that these can create jobs at less than 1/3 or even more much lower cost than is the case for business tax incentives. And I think the same argument would apply to business incubators, small business development centers, and other customized services to business that provide services that they otherwise could not access very readily. So we can do a lot better than simply handing out business tax incentives. We can emphasize some of the customized services to business that many of you are very involved in. How about neighborhoods? As I said, just plopping jobs down in the neighborhood is not a solution. Instead, you need to focus on trying to increase residents' job access, although I would define that broadly. Now, narrowly, you increase job access simply by improving the transit system, helping people get reliable used cars. But more broadly, we need to increase job support such as childcare. Other ideas I would push, neighborhood employment hubs that various places around the country operate these, where you bring the job information and job training programs and other service into the neighborhood. You put them at the local subsidized housing project, you locate it at local churches, you put them in the neighborhood where people lack jobs and need access to this information and these training services. Another idea I would push is employer resource networks, ERNs. My employer, the Upjohn Institute, runs these in the Kalamazoo area. And these are essentially cases where a number of smaller businesses will share the cost of a success coach who works with entry-level workers, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, new hires, to try to improve their job retention. So they might try to overcome problems that might cause a loss of job retention. I know in the Kalamazoo area, one thing they sometimes do is someone's car breaks down, they see if they can get them a short-term loan to get it fixed. And they can also provide many other services and link the family up with other services as needed. Another thing I think can work are discretionary subsidies for hiring and doing on-the-job training for non-employed neighborhood residents. I've over the years have pushed a program that Minnesota had in the 1980s called MEAD, but there are many other proposals for things like that. And from various studies, the cost per extra job for neighborhood residents providing these kind of job access services are around $70,000 per extra job. So, going back to the prior slide, certain business services create jobs at $50,000 a job, $100,000 a job, and certain subsidies and services in neighborhoods can create extra job opportunities at $70,000 per job. Now, that's not cheap. On the other hand, the social benefits of an additional job, when you look at the effect it has on substance abuse, engagement in criminal activity, on family structure, what it does to family stress, what impact it has on child development, any realistic measure of the present value of the social benefits from an extra job would far exceed $50,000, $70,000, or $100,000. On the other hand, it's not cheap. And if we want to close these employment gaps, when you try to do the calculations and say, what would it cost if we really wanted to significantly lower the employment rate gap between distressed places, either distressed local labor markets or distressed neighborhoods, and some measure of full employment? What would it actually take? And so, the recent report I did that came out in June that looks at how state governments can help distressed places. And that is a lengthy report, but the bottom line in terms of dollars is I estimate that the cost might be around $30 billion annually, of which about $21 billion would be for local labor markets, $9 billion for neighborhoods. And, based on some of these cost per job figures, I estimate that if you spent that, for 10 years, so that's a total of $300 billion, again, not trivial, but $30 billion a year for 10 years, you would create almost 4 million jobs, extra job opportunities, and you would close about 1/3 of the gap between these distressed places of employment rates and full employment. In other words, you would really significantly close geographic place-based gaps in the U.S. So, it's not cheap, but it is affordable, as I'll come back to. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is there is some discussion of expanding place-based policy, and I know various people are getting briefings on the CHIPS and Science Act and what it includes, and most of the discussion is focused on the semiconductor subsidies. But the CHIPS and Science Act also includes two other programs, one called Regional Technology Hubs that I assume a lot of you are interested in, and the other in $1 billion for a program called Recompete. And they're very similar, but the $10 billion is focused on developing high-tech areas, and the $1 billion is focused on helping distressed places. They could overlap. A place conceivably could apply for both, but they have somewhat different targets. So that's a total of $11 billion over 5 years. That's $11 billion is meant to be spent over 5 years. And on the one hand, this actually exceeds the two largest prior federal place-based subsidies. TVA at its peak in the 1950s spent about $9 billion in today's dollars over 5 years. And the Appalachian Regional Commission at its peak in the 1970s spent about $10 billion over 5 years. So if in fact the money is appropriated for these regional technology hubs and for this Recompete Distressed Place program, that would actually exceed the size of either TVA or the Appalachian Regional Commission. So it would not be trivial. On the other hand, as I mentioned, I think we should be spending $30 billion per year to really help all distressed places. That's $150 billion over 5 years. So, in my opinion, these programs from that perspective are pilot programs to demonstrate, to prove the concept of helping distressed places, and not fully the scale that's needed. So let me summarize when suggesting some things I think need to happen or need to be considered. We need to fully fund this CHIPS and Science Act because I think it could lead to some broader federal policies. Hopefully this will work well and be evaluated well, and then hopefully we can get support for expanding this to the needed scale, which, as I said, is $150 billion over 5 years, or $30 billion a year, which is less than 1% of federal taxes. On the other hand, not trivial. The report I mentioned also pushed the idea that state governments could do this, which they could. It's less than 3% of state taxes, and it's less than what we currently devote to business tax incentives. So we could fund this, for example, by scaling back business tax incentives somewhat and deciding to instead support some of these more important services. As I said, I think we need to always recognize when we do this the difference between how to help a distressed local labor market and how to help a distressed neighborhood. And the final point is just kind of a general philosophical point. I hope people will finally recognize that jobs to people strategies beat people to jobs policies. Not that we shouldn't encourage or allow or facilitate helping Americans be able to migrate to opportunity if they choose to do so. But it's not a solution to the problem of distressed places. It doesn't help those people left behind. We know that when people move out of a distressed place, the percentage decline in jobs is at least as great as the percentage decline in population. So it doesn't improve the employment to population ratio in the place that's left behind. I mean, Flint, Michigan has had plenty of out-migration. It has not helped improve the employment to population ratio in Flint. That's the reality. It simply doesn't do that. And on the other hand, jobs to people strategies, if they're run in a cost-effective way, can actually promote not just equity, but national economic efficiency. What you're doing is you're allocating more jobs to where the people are. You're raising the sustainable national employment rate without excess inflationary pressures, which we're very concerned about right now in the macroeconomy. So one issue is, how do we keep employment rates high while not having excess inflationary pressure? And one way of doing that is making sure that a greater share of the jobs go to where more non-employed people are. That is a strategy that will actually, it's simply not, it's, a lot of times people argue on helping distressed places as a matter of equity. It's a matter of economic efficiency. We're increasing the overall size of the national economic pie. We're also advancing equity goals, but we are also increasing the size of the pie. So let me stop there and we can have further conversation and I can respond to some questions.
Thanks, Tim. Just for our audience, John Prover and I are going to ask Dr. Bartik some questions, but please feel free, when we're finished with that, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you want to be unmuted to ask a question, just raise your hand and we will unmute you to ask your question, or you can put them in the chat and I'll be monitoring that. Dr. Bartik, thank you so much. I was reminded of a quote that I heard that I will not attribute to someone in Washington State when I was working there in economic development policy, who said, rural economic development is a ticket to Seattle, which obviously is the failed people to jobs strategy that you cited earlier. Question that I wanted to ask has to do with the fact that your policy prescriptions involve local job creation block grants by states to local governments to offer both customized business services and job access services for residents of distressed neighborhoods. And there are already a lot of programs of this type that exist, like Manufacturing Extension, Small Business Development Center, Workforce Development Services. Where do you feel that they're currently falling short?
Well, one, as I said, I think they're simply not at a sufficient scale. I think things like TVA and ARC made a difference for certain portions of the country, but if we really are going to do it in a systematic way nationwide, we need to spend a lot more money. So one is simply a question of scale. We're not spending enough on this. The other is the issue of flexibility. So I'm a great proponent of let's empower local communities to come up with their own solutions that fit local needs. So, manufacturing extension service, I pushed them over the years. I think there's a lot of evidence that they can be very effective in increasing manufacturing competitiveness. But are they a solution for all areas? Well, obviously not. There are many areas that manufacturing is not really how they should be oriented their economy. It depends on the local context. So, I would prefer to make more of the funds available through block grants that could be used for a variety of services, rather than having each little siloed program, which, you can make work. And that's a lot of what a lot of the folks here do, is that they figure out ways of combining revenue from many different sources and somehow combining it all together. But it's not easy to do. I think we should be trying at both the federal and state level to make it much easier to do.
And just to follow up on that, a lot of the universities that are part of the ARENI network are managing some of these programs like SBDCs and manufacturing extension and workforce efforts. So given the constraints that they're facing, the lack of flexibility that they have because of many of the constraints that these programs put on them, how might they go about being more productive and getting more bang for their buck?
Well, how do you be more productive? I mean, that's like a very broad question, trying to narrow it down. I mean, part of it is by trying to, if you can get waivers so that you can avoid some of the restrictions, that would help. I mean, I'm a big proponent of evaluating what you're doing, and I'll just briefly promote a book. In 2019, I wrote a book called Making Sense of Incentives. It's available for free download, so I'm not getting any royalties on this. And there's a whole chapter there on evaluating economic development programs. And I give examples of evaluations, and so I'm a big proponent. I think, maybe a lot of you already do that, but really doing high quality surveys of clients of the programs, but done by a third party so that it's independent, really high quality focus groups with some of the clients and interviews that from an outside evaluator who again is independent of your program. So you need to be open to hearing that the seminars you ran on increasing exporting were not good that the person who did them didn't do a very effective job for whatever reason. So you need to be prepared to hear that. I also think we could do much more systematically. I think that every state should think about how do they take their UI data files on firms and their jobs and perhaps make them available so they can be easily used for ongoing evaluation of assisted firms and unassisted firms. And a lot of universities, particularly public universities, can maybe access that data fairly, hopefully in your state based on confidentiality restrictions. But really, we need to set up, this has been done in the education sphere. There are a number of states that have set up education data sets where you can follow students over time and see their progress, see what happened to students who were in one program versus another program. We need to have the same capability for firms. States should have databases where you can link up your records of who you're assisting versus who you're not assisting, try to control for what you can control for, and see, are the firms we're working with doing better than very similar match firms? And we really should be thinking about facilitating that database construction. And public universities could play a role in advocating for that within the state bureaucracy.
Thanks. You're speaking many people's tune, or singing their tune. Many of the folks on the call. I'm thinking about Mark White, who's our guy at the University of Missouri, who's a labor market information specialist, and I'm sure could help us pull that database together. I'm going to pause now and turn it over to John for some of the questions that he's got for you.
Yeah, I'm all aflutter. Evaluation and somebody who actually knows how hard our jobs are. I don't get that all day long. So listen, one of the things that I spend a lot of time staring at is the size of our university's real estate portfolio. And also, the volume of things that are in our other kind of campus operations. And, clearly, from an economic impact point of view, those could be considered probably some of the biggest impacts we have on place, but they're not always managed in a very place-aware fashion. And I guess I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how we can use our purchasing and hiring power or other things to, be more effective and more place-aware.
I guess I would push the hiring thing the most. I'll mention the purchase thing as well. Universities hire a lot. I think universities should be exemplary employers in adopting policies that hopefully are inclusive in how they do hiring. So I'll mention two programs. One is a program called Higher Reach, which is spelled as one word as a label, which is a program that the Kellogg Foundation has funded in various places in West Michigan, and I think they're trying to bring it nationwide. And Higher Reach is an idea of asking employers, how to make sure that their hiring is as inclusive as possible. Now, one thing it includes, and maybe there's a little bit of tension with the universities, is they ask you to look at your credential requirements. Does this position actually require a master's degree? Now, I know universities want to think that everything requires a PhD, but maybe in hiring, universities say, what does this actually require in terms of credential? And employers should be asking that and not exaggerate it, because it creates real barriers for some people to get jobs. Higher Reach also does something which they do some name blinding of initial resume review, which deals with some unconscious biases people might have, that if a name is associated with an ethnic or racial group, it would be, I'm not saying it's intentional, but sometimes things like that can happen. And the other program is, I already mentioned, the ERN program, Employer Resource Networks. I think universities could make sure, universities usually are big enough, they maybe wouldn't need to be part of a formal ERN, but they should be providing these kind of services where a success coach says, look, if we're going to hire people who maybe some of whom are long-term unemployed or have had labor market challenges in the past, or who don't have a huge amount of labor market experience, and whose family maybe faces some challenges, we're going to maybe need to provide some support services to increase job retention. And I think again, universities could be a model for that. I'm also all in favor of, the procurement and doing locally. I've estimated in the past that if you buy from a locally owned company, the multiplier goes up by about 0.25, which sounds trivial, but can be a big thing in terms of multiplier effects of universities. But the final thing I'd also mention is a core function of universities obviously is education and training. And we really should be thinking about, and I know some of your organizations do this, but trying to mobilize the resources of the university in terms of education to both provide better educational services to students and also provide service to local business. So let's mobilize the business students and computer science students to help local businesses with needs in certain areas. Let's mobilize the history students to work with local groups on maybe tourism type things. Political science and sociology and social work students could be working with the community groups and helping them become more aware of federal grants they could get. You could think of a variety of things. Now, obviously, some of this already goes on. I'm not saying it doesn't go on, but is it pushed to the extent it could be? I'm not sure it is. I mean, we could really systematically say we as a university want to have as many classes as possible interacting with the community, and we're going to subsidize professors to develop curricula that do that and really push this very heavily. And I think that would make a real difference in not only impacting the community, it also obviously would have incredible PR benefits for universities.
Yeah, I think that incentive thing is a big gap, because you're right, that does take place. And a lot of this stuff, everybody's talking experiential learning now, but moving it out of a theoretical back office space. Let me throw one more sort of place-focused question, and then I think we do have some good questions queuing up in the Q&A box. I'm also so excited to see, and I know they're reading you and they're reading, a lot of Brookings stuff, but the administration has done quite a job of injecting place awareness into a number of federal programs. Build Back Better, Good Jobs Challenge, the innovation engines. And that's the kind of stuff where, there's enough scale there that it's getting attention from, let's say, some administrators who might otherwise be aspatial, I guess, when they think about their business operations and growing their research portfolios and such. So when we think about, this lever of place, again, back to our bosses and our institutions, are there other places that we could be clubbing our bosses, or articulating is maybe a nicer way to say, a message about place in other federal programs, things we can advocate for and such?
Well, I would certainly hope that universities would be advocating for not just the the CHIPS and Science Act, as I mentioned, includes these regional technology hubs and recompete. The question is, will the money be appropriated? I would think that universities want to lobby to make sure that $11 billion is actually appropriated. And then beyond that, I think we need to ask, can we make a more major federal commitment in this area? And as I said, one of the things I want to mention is that there's no reason why state governments couldn't do a lot more in this area. I really think that if you look at it, New York is a very prosperous state. It really could do a lot more to help upstate New York. I mean, there is stuff, I'm not saying there's nothing going on, but it could do more. California, very prosperous state. And yet when you look at it, outside of the booming coastal cities, a lot of the rest of the state is a basket case economically. I mean, it really is not good. And the state of California could readily afford to do a lot more to help those communities. And I really think we need to articulate to states. I mean, the problem is handing out business tax incentives to a few big companies is very politically popular, and not just with the people who get the money, but with the public. It attracts a lot of attention. And we need to somehow increase the political reward in state policy to instead of helping one big company with a big tax incentive, helping 100 smaller companies or 1,000 smaller companies with various problems they face. And we need to articulate how big an impact that has. That's partly why I push this evaluation. How do you articulate how big the impact is? Well, you need at some point to give an estimate to someone saying, the efforts of us working with these 1,000 small businesses have produced these many jobs, this much an increased employment rate, this much an increased earnings. Here's what it's done to the tax base of the area. Well, let's really try to make these benefits more visible. The big company is really visible, and that attracts all the political support and attention. We just somehow get around that politically, and universities maybe can do that, not just through what they do, but through, I mean, all universities have researchers. They're all looking to get tenure. You know, get your assistant professors looking to get tenure to start doing some studies of what the university is doing in the community.
Well, look, I like that. I think, in Virginia, we did something, we're doing something now called Growth Opportunity Virginia. We actually modeled it on something New York State did a number of years ago called NY Star. And it's really like regional higher ed business partnerships that get a certain amount of money to spend and invest in a catalytic way. I think the New York program maybe like went by the boards, but I think there are a couple of other states that looked at that and really, by decentralizing, you get down to like a more granular level of business to some extent. It's still kind of creaming a little bit at the regional level, but it's something, getting the money closer to the street, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks, Tim. I would like to go to Russell Mills. Jennifer, can we unmute Russell to ask his question? He had a couple.
Hey, Sheila. Hey,
Russell.
Tim.
Hi.
Great. Thanks for your work. I appreciate it. I guess I had two questions. I guess sort of one part. Many local labor markets have the opposite problem, right? With too few employees available for different jobs at the moment. I'm curious, given some of the discrepancies that your map highlighted in states, right, where there's winners and losers, what's an approach, and you were sort of alluding to this in your last set of comments, what's an approach state economic development officials can try to really, either whether it be through incentives or some of the, the focus on smaller to mid-sized businesses that you mentioned, how can they sort of, share the wealth, I guess, right? In distressed areas versus labor markets where there's already, tight, very tight labor markets. I'm thinking in Ohio where I am, right? Toledo versus Columbus, Cincinnati, and to some extent Cleveland.
Well, I mean, I do think that states should be targeting distressed local labor markets, and but I think they should help. Look, I mean, there are a lot of places that aren't necessarily distressed that are still short of full employment. So, in my view, a more politically possible stance is, rather than simply saying we're just going to help the most distressed 10 or 20% of the state and everyone else, you're on your own, is to say, look, we will try to provide assistance, flexible block grants to all areas of the state, and the block grant will be a formula based on how many non-employed prime age people you have, for example. And it will be higher if you have, twice the number of non-employed prime age people. If that's our goal, you get twice as much money. And that's one thing. So let's help all areas of the state, but let's targeting within universalism as a kind of a political philosophy. The other thing is to note is that, as I mentioned, within even a booming area, there typically are pockets of high non-employment and certainly a lot of people in low wage jobs. A booming local labor market is an opportunity to really get employers and local government and universities all involved with how do we reach out to this neighborhood that has been left out of economic opportunity, and how do we somehow overcome the barriers to access to jobs, which may include some of these job retention problems I mentioned that people have, maybe due to family problems going on, unstable housing situations, a variety of problems. That you need to kind of have a customized intervention with some kind of social work success coach. And we need to do that and try to and it's also an opportunity for upgrading. This whole, having a economy where there's a shortage of labor supply is an opportunity to see how can we upgrade people, and job training programs can help facilitate that. So I think we need to look on this as an opportunity to bring up certain places and also upgrade, get people promoted to better jobs.
Yeah, I guess the second, you sort of touched on it, the second part of my question really has to do with wages, right? Your analysis, which is great, it looks really at unemployment, but EDA and other federal agencies use, wage rates, median income, et cetera, as another metric of distress. I'm just curious, how you sort of hypothesize or envision the policy prescriptions you outline, might affect wages and local labor markets in the long run.
Well, I think if you tighten up employment rates, wages will go up. I mean, that's the reality. We know that when people are having trouble finding work, it will lead to upward pressure on wages. Employers will compete with each other. The market there works. I mean, people will upgrade their wages. We'll also do lower credential requirements for hiring people, so people can get upgraded to better jobs. So I think a higher employment rate does in fact increase wages. Now, I also think I have done some other work looking at wage rates and how they affect things. It is definitely true that the so-called mid-wage, mid-credential jobs seem to show the greatest payoff. That, in other words, if you categorize jobs by being kind of low wage, low credential, mid wage, mid credential, high wage, high credential. The mid wage, mid credential jobs show the greatest payoff, especially for more workers with less education. It doesn't mean that the other jobs don't have a payoff. It's just that you need to do more to make them pay off. In other words, one of the key problems is how do we, if we're creating high wage, high tech jobs, how do we enable upgrading of people to those jobs? So I do think we need to be concerned about wages, but the policy recommendation there shouldn't be, therefore, it is always better to go after the highest wage jobs you can. It's not always clear that that's the case. Job quality relates to what the wage is relative to the credentials required for the job, more than simply the wage by itself.
Thank you very much.
Those are great insights, Tim. I remember back in the really tight labor market prior to the pandemic, there were a lot of employers that were reaching into the formerly incarcerated population in order to try to identify people who had talent but were being blocked from the labor market in that way. And another barrier to many people entering the labor market is childcare. So I'm going to ask Mark White. Jennifer, could we promote Mark White so he could ask his question in person? Go ahead, Mark. Mark?
So fair. Yeah, hello. Childcare is either expensive or unavailable for a lot of people. And when you have in Missouri, for instance, we have, people going to, like 25 to 30% of the districts in Missouri only go 4 days a week. And so that kind of increases the need for childcare services at a time when, when low wages paid to, childcare workers makes it harder for them to kind of appropriately staff childcare centers. So, I guess if you, in short, could you just speak a little bit to the role that childcare plays in terms of limiting people's abilities to participate in the labor force in some of these neighborhoods, and what are some realistic options for actually addressing that issue?
Well, I think it's very important. And as people may or may not know, I've written 2 books about early childhood education, and one book specifically talked about how it supports local economic development. And I recently gave a talk to a group in Battle Creek and Kalamazoo called something like the business case for early childhood programs, which you can find somewhere on the Upjohn Institute website. Any event, I think it's really critical. I mean, I guess, one of the issues is childcare is inherently expensive if you want to have high quality and you want to retain the workforce in these areas. And it's expensive because we need to have low ratios of children to care providers, especially when we get to infant care, 1 and 2 year olds, but even in 3 and 4 year olds need to have lower class size per teacher than is true, say, for 6th graders. So these things are inherently expensive. I mean, my view is we should be, states have gotten a lot of money through these various plans. We need to be thinking about providing additional child care subsidies. We also need to be thinking about, and I mean, I would start with I'm a big proponent of universally available preschool, not universally required preschool, universally available preschool that, might have some sliding fee scale, depending on your income, but for 3 and 4-year-olds. And there was some evidence that kind of program by itself would have a big labor supply impact. So, for example, the District of Columbia has universal free preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds. And after that was instituted, it increased the labor force participation rate of all mothers with kids under the age of 5 by 10 percentage points. And that's a remarkable effect of a program. Some of these mothers with kids under 5 have 1 and 2-year-olds. So we're talking about this very large impact of simply providing preschool for 9 months a year for 3 and 4-year-olds. So I don't think we should let the fact that dealing comprehensively, look, we're not going to have the Norwegian system anytime soon without federal money. I mean, Norwegian system is starting at age 1. They have something called Barneshagen, which is the Norwegian name for kindergarten. That's a subsidized childcare system with income-based fee schedules from age 1 on up. That would be so expensive in the U.S. It would require federal funding, I think. To be honest with you, I just think it's hard to see how states are going to do that on their own. But we should not let the best be the enemy of the good. Let's move as soon as we can towards universal preschool at age 4. Let's move to universal preschool at age 3. That would help. Let's provide some additional child care subsidies. That would help. And let's gradually whittle away at this problem. Let's also explore, I like the model that Michigan has, is there's a tri-share childcare system under which the proposal is that the state will pay 1/3 of the cost of childcare, the employer will pay 1/3, and the household will pay 1/3. Is that a solution? Well, it tries to say, look, the state cannot afford to do 100% of this. We can't do what Norway does right now. But we could maybe pay 1/3 of the share, and maybe we could get employers. Employers are complaining they can't get workers. This is a chance for employers to maybe put some money into this, and in exchange for which they would get essentially a public subsidy for part of this. So look at a tri-share model.
That's a great model to take a look at, Tim. And I'm just going to pause here for a moment because we have another set of poll questions that Jennifer is going to put up for us that we need to interrupt the webinar for, because we are trying to evaluate the ARENI program. And we need feedback from those of you who are participating in our programming to provide us some information about how you're finding us and how you're feeling about what we're doing. So I want to thank you, Tim. We will be posting the recording of the webinar. We will be sending it out to everyone who registered. And I'll also be commenting on number 365. But remember that we'll be continuing these conversations at the UBETA Summit in San Antonio, October 9th through 12th. And the first day of that summit will be what we call Economic Accelerator Day, which is focused on the ARENI issues of equity, resilience, and university centers. So we have some great programming. We have a keynote from Rhonda Sharp from the Weiser Policy Institute, who is focused on diversifying the opinions that go into policy debates such as this one. We have a great panel of HBCU leaders talking about working in their communities. And we have a federal panel of folks who are going to talk about how universities can work with their federal partners to build equity and resilience in their community. So I want to also remind you that we will not have a convening in October because of the summit, but we will have a convening on November 16th in partnership with the UITA Innovation Network. And we will be talking about the CHIPS Act, and the Century Foundation will be talking about their work to inject DEI and equity issues into the CHIPS Act. So please join us. You'll be getting some information about that in a few weeks. And I hope to see you all at the summit in San Antonio. Thanks, everybody. And thank you very much to Dr. Bartik for sharing his research with us. Thanks for the conversation, everyone.